Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the East-West Center in Washington's afternoon virtual seminar program. Today's program is on the U.S.-Japan cooperation on vocational training and education in ASEAN. And our speaker this afternoon is Mr. William or Whit Lloyd from Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. Right now on your screen, hopefully you'll be seeing the protocol, which gives you basic guidelines for managing today's virtual program. And it simply states that please use the raise hand function at the termination of Mr. Lloyd's opening remarks and to take your Q&A, and further elaborations can be done through the chat function. And if you have a two-finger intervention, you can show your video and raise two fingers to show that you would like to address a point that is being made during the discussion period. In any case, let me introduce myself. My name is Satu Limaye. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center and the Director of the East-West Center in Washington. And it's my pleasure to have this topic and our speaker today because it's part of a larger visiting fellowship and exchange and research program called the U.S., Japan, and Southeast Asia in a Dynamic Asia. And the purpose of this program, funded by the Japan Foundation and the US Embassy in Tokyo, is to create a new generation of Americans, Japanese, and Southeast Asians who are rising experts, scholars, practitioners who are engaged with each other to look for cooperation and coordination on various contemporary policy issues in the region. And I can think of nothing more sort of important than human capital development, vocational training and education as Southeast Asia's economies develop. Now, we all know that the current COVID-19 situation has created a number of uncertainties, but there are some structural issues related to Southeast Asia's move up the value chain, its participation in supply chains, its engagement with its regional neighbors and the global system. And Whit is going to take us through approximately a 30-minute presentation on his research, looking at how Southeast Asia is looking at issues related to automation, demography, technological disruption, and COVID, with the goal of finding out how the US, Japan, and Southeast Asia can align efforts for mutual interests, since the US and Japan are also heavily invested in and cooperative with Southeast Asian countries. With that, let me invite Mr. Lloyd, who has extensive experience in Japan as a JET alumnus, is finishing his MA at SAIS, as I mentioned, and invite him to open up with his remarks in PowerPoint. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you everyone for coming. Let me present my PowerPoint. So my research has been focusing on vocational training and education. I spent some time in Japan doing research there and followed that up with some time in DC. So I found a lot of very interesting topics and ways that the United States can actually work to, and Japan can work to really improve vocational education throughout Southeast Asia. So I've set up my PowerPoint going through the ASEAN economic community, followed by challenges that the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the AEC are facing. These include fertility rates, education, and automation. Then I'll do a quick summary of what technical and vocational education training is, followed by what ASEAN is doing regarding TVET today, and then what Japan and the US can do to help, followed by a small section on COVID-19. So the ASEAN economic community is designed to be a single market and production base within ASEAN. As a bloc, it holds over 600 million people and is estimated to be the fifth largest economy with a GDP of 2.95 trillion, according to the most recent ASEAN integration report. Now, the AEC started off in 2015. Many of its goals are fairly straightforward with trade. For example, tariff reductions, the reduction of non-tariff trade barriers, and the AEC countries have been growing quite rapidly. but they do have some systemic challenges. Probably the first among these is fertility rates throughout Southeast Asia. This is a graph by the ASEAN Post, in which it shows that fertility rates have been declining throughout Southeast Asia for several years. The replacement rate is about 2.1 births per woman, and most countries in Southeast Asia are below that. Thailand has a 1.4 births per woman. Singapore is lower. Even Vietnam, which has been growing quite rapidly, has a lower than replacement rate birth rate. The only exceptions are the Philippines and Indonesia. Indonesia, for example, is expecting to have about 70% of its population be of a workforce age. That's 15 years to 64 years old in the near future. And the Philippines is also having a major growth rate. Now, overall birth rates in Southeast Asia are 2.1, but since many of these countries are lower, what that will mean in the long term is that there will be a shortage of labor, and likely that will incentivize greater automation. Automation targets routine jobs, it targets lower skilled jobs, and that will cause a cycle where more people without the ability to get high skilled qualifications and certifications are unable to contribute productively to the economy, and that will increase economic and social strains. Chief among these challenges for high skilled jobs is that the education in these countries is not qualitatively at the level of a lot of high skilled jobs require. If you look up here, we have Singapore. This is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development's PISA study, and they go around every 3 years and test students in math, in science, and in reading, apply those to real world situations, and then try to see how the students use their skills to solve problems. Now, the challenge here is that the PISA study, the Program for International Student Assessment, ranked Singapore very highly, but the rest of the ASEAN countries that were tested are quite low. You get Singapore at number 2, and then you go to the bottom third, and you get Malaysia, Brunei, Thailand, and near the bottom you have Indonesia, and then the Philippines. So the 2 countries that are still growing don't have a high level of academic achievement, and high level countries or the other countries, they're actually facing shrinking populations. Now, automation in ASEAN has been embraced. Many ASEAN countries are looking forward to using automation to increase competitivity, to increase worker safety. Thailand, for example, in 2016 released a program for their economy that they call Thailand 4.0. And the stated goal was 50% of their manufacturing would be automated by 2021. The Thailand Development Research Institute said that was a little impractical. Currently, they don't have the workforce skills necessary. The education structure isn't where it needs to be to have 50% of their manufacturing automated by 2021. One of the people who is a fellow at the Thailand Development Research Institute estimated it would take about 10 years before they could really seriously start facing this. Furthermore, this push for automation could result in large unemployment, according to the Bangkok Post. Indonesia has also embraced automation and is actually trying to solve some of the issues that come along with that obsolescence of low-skilled routine jobs. And that includes handing out pre-employment cards for vocational training. They instituted that in March this year, and they're planning on giving out 2 million of these cards for effectively free vocational education. Lastly, in Singapore, you have Omron, which is an automation company, and they've opened up an automation park, which is part research institute, part showroom, and part testing ground for potential customers to come and see how their products can be built with automation. So automation is going to create a much more competitive environment. It's going to make the production and manufacturing of products much more efficient, but it's going to cause a big spike in unemployment. So let me give you a few examples. Automotive engineering in ASEAN creates 800,000 jobs. In Indonesia, because of automation, 60% of those jobs are at high risk. 73% in Thailand are at high risk. In electronics, this is radios, this is anything that you need to put a battery into. It creates 2.5 million jobs in ASEAN. But in Vietnam, the Philippines, Myanmar, and Indonesia, there are high percentages of these jobs that are at risk of automation. This graph right here shows the percentage for each country: 63 for Indonesia, 74 for Myanmar, 81% in the Philippines. And then you have textiles, clothing, and footwear. That creates 9 million jobs. And the vast majority of those jobs in Laos, Cambodia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam are actually done by women. So textiles is at serious risk of automation because of 3D printing, because of sobots that can now stitch clothes together, whereas previously that was not possible. And what this will do is that economic independence for women will actually take a step backwards from where it is today. Lastly, we have business process outsourcing. And according to the ILO, it creates 1 million jobs in the Philippines, 60% of which are in call centers. And of all BPO jobs in the Philippines, 89% are at risk of automation. And the reason for this is that the incentives are there to start replacing these jobs. For example, according to the International Labor Organization, having software automation rather than actual call center workers reduces costs between 45 and 70%. So companies are pushing for this, and in a lot of cases, there aren't other jobs available. Now, when I first started looking at what automation would do, I expected to see a big change in unemployment. For example, in Singapore, I expected to see a big spike. Now, when I went onto the CEIC data website and started looking up unemployment, I didn't see that. So my next question was, why? And you might notice that some of these numbers are strangely low. For example, in 2017, here's the percentage, and here's the year. Cambodia said it had a 0.1% unemployment rate, which first I thought, is that even possible? I'm not an economist, but that doesn't seem realistic. And there's actually a very good reason behind this. So these countries in ASEAN usually count seasonal work on a farm, for example, as employment throughout their year. And they also count what we would call informal labor. So if it's paid under the table, or it doesn't really have benefits packages, it isn't a consistent job, that is counted as employment. So it might be better to say that there's a large section of these countries that is underemployed. And as automation continues, if nothing is done to kind of give these people new skills that they can then transfer to a new job, you'll see greater underemployment and you will see greater unemployment. In short, you have a few problems. You have lower levels of education, that's in literacy, in math. So right now, if you try to send someone into a vocational school, they might not get the optimal education they could, simply because they don't have the foundation. And low-skilled jobs are great when you have lower skilled workers, which ASEAN has. But as automation comes in, those jobs vanish and the workers don't. The workers are going to be needing to find new jobs, and they might not have the transferable skills necessary to get the next job. Higher skilled jobs require degrees and certifications. The ability to acquire these is limited because there's the economic barriers to a lot of these jobs, and a lot of the education necessary for these jobs. one thing I have learned at SAIS through the various economics classes is that automation can actually aggravate income inequality, which will make it harder to get these higher skilled qualifications. Now, what does technical and vocational education do to solve or at least ameliorate some of these challenges? Well, it's been used in Southeast Asia for decades. A great example is Malaysia used it to help develop its manufacturing and other sectors. In the vocational education can last 3 months, it can last 3 years. It is much more flexible and is thus less time intensive than a college degree, and it gives you skills directly. Whereas a college degree, you might focus on social science, you might focus on the economics. Vocational education focuses on skills, where you can then graduate, go to a job, say, here's my certification, and your employer will know you have the skills to do the job. Well, since technical vocational education is so great, what is ASEAN doing about it now? And they're actually trying to do quite a bit. So ASEAN recently came up with something they call the ASEAN Guiding Principles for Quality Assurance and Recognition Competency Certification Systems. In short, that is, they're trying to standardize qualifications across ASEAN. So you can go to a vocational education system in the Philippines, then move to Thailand, and your qualifications will still be credible in Thailand. It would be like saying a lawyer has passed the bar in New York and can now work in California. And as part of this, every country has come up with what they call a national qualifications framework. And various countries are in various stages of actually developing these frameworks and instituting them. But so far, it's progressing at a fairly nice clip. This doesn't mean there aren't problems. So a great example is bureaucracy in Myanmar. There are 19 ministries involved in vocational education, and they have overlapping mandates, and it appears to be a bit of a disorganized system right now. In the Lao People's Democratic Republic, the government is pushing for greater vocational education, but it's not communicating with domestic businesses. So students are getting skills they don't need to get hired. And so you're having someone dedicate a sizable chunk of their time to get a skill that is unnecessary. In Cambodia, teaching methods focus on the teacher. It's very lecture-centric, not experiential. And so the result is that the students know a lot of theory, but they don't have a lot of practical experience. And in the Philippines, Springer Education, publication coming in Singapore, in one of their books, they noted that there was a poll done of domestic businesses in the Philippines, and the majority reported that their vocational education students did not have the quality of the skills they expected. And so they were hiring people and then realizing they didn't have the skills necessary. So that is a problem. ASEAN-wide, there's also the problem that technical and vocational education is seen as decidedly second tier, according to Springer, which means that less people are going into vocational education than would otherwise, because if you go into vocational education rather than a college, people think that it means you couldn't get into a college, which obviously is not the case. Now, there is a big exception to some of the vocational education hurdles in Southeast Asia, and that is Singapore's skills future. And what Singapore is doing is they're trying to incentivize lifelong education, where people consistently take new classes and don't just say, oh, I have my degree, I'm done learning. And what they will do is every resident of Singapore has an educational bank account, basically, and the Singaporean government will actually put money into that to try to subsidize the taking of classes. And Singapore keeps pretty close track of this. Last year, roughly 50% of Singapore's residents did take classes to either level up their skills or learn new skills. And this has helped Singapore adapt to some of the technological disruption and it results in it being less disruptive than it would be otherwise. Now, Japan and the US, what can they do about this? Well, as we all know, Japan and the US have major relationships with ASEAN states. There's big trading relationships, there are military alliances, and there is, according to US government officials that I've talked to, there's actually a big interest in the US and Japan funding education in ASEAN, not just in vocational education, but in primary, higher education, and vocational education. So I would suspect that if the US and Japan came forward and said, here's our plan, many ASEAN states would probably say something along the lines of, where do we sign? Also, the development of vocational education serves the interest of the United States and Japan, because if ASEAN states have greater unemployment, they are going to be consuming less, and that means less imports from Japan and the US to ASEAN. Now, Japan in particular is the biggest foreign direct investor in ASEAN. It outmatches China here. And they have been invested in vocational infrastructure and development in ASEAN since at least the 80s. They did this through an organization they call JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency. And I found a list of some of where they have invested in vocational infrastructure, and that includes the Philippines, it includes Thailand, it includes Malaysia. For example, in Thailand in the 80s, as a way to try to reduce economic disparity between rural regions of Thailand and the main cities, Japan funded an agricultural technical school. The amount that costed them was not all that sizable at the time, but it was one school, and Japan did the survey, they prepared the teachers, they bought the supplies, and they covered a lot of the initial costs. Funding for similar projects lasted until around 2002, which was the latest project I could find in the Philippines. JICA's current focus tends to be more on higher education rather than vocational education. The United States is also really involved in education and human capital development in ASEAN. They have a program they call the Young Southeast Asian Leadership Initiative, in which, according to the website on USAID, is focused on bringing students over to the United States to learn and sending them back, and those students become entrepreneurs or managers or benefit their country in some way. And roughly, in conjunction with the Fulbright Scholarship, roughly 5,000 Southeast Asians have come over to the United States and gone back. Furthermore, they have an online segment where people who don't want to go to the United States or can't can actually sign up and get certifications and be taught classes online by US professors. Furthermore, USAID had a program between 2014 and 2019 that they called the Lower Mekong Initiative, connecting the Mekong through education and training. And that program reportedly aimed to train 80,000 students. The last report I saw, it has trained 60,000 students across Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. And they've also trained nearly 1,000 instructors. So this is not just focused on students, it's also focused on improving teaching skills in teachers, which is an important part of vocational education. And the same site on USAID.gov said that between 2012 and 2017, the US provided an estimated $4 billion to human capital development initiatives. Also, there was supposed to be a US-ASEAN summit in Las Vegas, and US officials have said that they were planning on having a announcement for new capital development programs, predominantly human capital development programs in Southeast Asia. Those have been delayed because the conference was canceled for obvious reasons, COVID-19. And so what those programs are, I don't know, but that is something to look into in the future and keep an eye on. So the US and Japan need to create a TVET program, and they each have specific skills where they should kind of take point on. So Japan has a lot of experience building infrastructure. It has a huge amount of credibility in doing so. And it also has the supplies and capital on hand to really develop new schools, new systems, and actually provide a lot of the supplies necessary for these schools to succeed. On the other hand, the United States has a lot of experience training teachers through, for example, the YSEALI program, which trained 1,000 teachers. And obviously, if you don't have good teachers, you're not going to have the optimum experience with vocational education. The same if you don't have good infrastructure. And when they're doing these, they need to communicate with each other because, well, if they go and do their own thing, this program is going to become disjointed. You're going to have construction in one region when you're having teachers being trained in another. You can't exactly insist people move to actually be employed as teachers. Furthermore, there's the challenge where students might not have the foundational skills in math or science or reading that are necessary to really benefit from vocational education. And that means that Japan and the United States need to work together to build a program that is like a vocational education preparatory program, and in math, in science, and in reading. And they should partner up with firms in, say, Singapore to do this because there are concerns about data localization, and maybe if there's a firm in Singapore doing this, that might ease some of those concerns. Furthermore, they won't have to turn to, say, Silicon Valley or Japan if they want to modify this program in the future. They can modify it through Singaporean companies or their own companies afterwards. And then you need to focus on lifelong learning afterwards. Because if you give them the skills necessary to succeed today, whether that be in coding or in robotics or in electrical engineering, which is where these programs should focus, the technology is moving at such a pace that knowledge might be quickly outdated in 10 or 15 years. And the challenge there is if they don't continue to learn and take new classes and update their skills, they're going to run into a problem just like what they're facing today. So lifelong learning is a critical part of this. And I think they should take a page out of Salesforce's book, where they incentivize the continued learning of the populace. Now, how does COVID-19 affect this? Well, COVID-19 is spreading. It's scary here in the United States. And from the economists I've talked to, it's going to devastate Southeast Asia. Now, some countries are trying to use this as an opportunity to fund vocational education to avert the worst of an economic slowdown. But ASEAN has run into a few problems. Malaysia and Thailand have shut their borders. Thailand, according to Reuters, has lost already an estimated 7 million jobs. The Thai Chamber of Commerce predicts that if this continues, that could reach 10 million in the next few months. Foreign visitors have been banned from Indonesia. Sea and land ports have been closed. Vietnam's growth has been downgraded by the IMF from an estimated 7% to 2.7%. So that's a big drop. And long term, what this means is there will either be a fiscal crunch where these countries say we have to shelve our more ambitious programs, for example, incentivizing automation. Or what could happen is they could say the short-term costs of automation are such that, well, it will be painful now. The long-term resilience we gain, because these countries do focus on resilience a lot, they might say it's worth the costs now to continue to automate and to accelerate the automation process because robots don't get sick. we can make our factories more competitive, faster, more efficient, and cheaper. And we don't have to necessarily worry about another COVID-19 coming through and completely devastating our economy the way it is today. Indonesia has invested 719 million in vocational education. That plan was originally going to start in the summer, but they moved it up to March because they want to avoid some of the economic challenges they suspect they will face in the future. So countries are trying to do something about COVID-19, but the long-term effects are still a little bit up in the air. In conclusion, vocational training is going to be critical. These countries need new skills because the job market is changing in these countries. It's going to be more towards coding, software development, robots. So if they don't take advantage of this, and if the US and Japan don't help, this change is going to either be slow or non-existent until it gets to a point where things get really, really bad. And one thing that is a bright spot that really should be accelerated is the standardization of vocational education around the region. And the reason for this is that Thailand is going to be facing a large labor shortage, whereas the Philippines will have a labor surplus. And what that means is that extra Thai workers, extra Filipino workers can go to Thailand and actually have their skills be utilized in a way that is productive for their home economy, for themselves, and for Thailand. Thank you very much.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Lloyd. That's a terrific framework for us to begin a discussion. And we have approximately now, roughly 26 minutes or so where we can engage. And just as Ms. Sarah Wong has reminded us, please use the raise hands function on the Zoom to indicate that you want to ask a question. And if you have something specifically on a conversation that's taking place, you can send that via chat and we'll insert you into that discussion so we can stay on point. Let me begin by, first of all, congratulating Whit on the presentation, and especially in the midst of COVID and the uncertainties presented. I want to flag two things. You talked a lot about the economists you've spoken with, interviewed, trying to understand what are the different views of what the impacts, but you largely focused on what the impacts would be on Southeast Asian countries. I'm mindful, since this is a US-Japan cooperation with Southeast Asia, that US and Japan will also have limitations as a result of COVID. And there may be analogous constraints both here in the United States as well as in Japan on availability of funding, priorities, next steps, recalculating supply chains, et cetera. So just to tuck that away. And the other thing I was very curious about as you proceed, and I should tell our attending audience that this is just the initial part of Whit's research, both in Japan and the United States, but eventually we intend to go to Southeast Asia with our fellows where they can do further interviews and lead to longer, more researched efforts in addition to the Asia Pacific Bulletin that was released prior to this program. And one of the things you might consider doing is looking at a case study or two by focusing on one effort of Japan, one by the US, and maybe a private sector example where a company, either Japanese or American, has built a vocational effort as part of corporate social responsibility or as part of their own effort because they need good, highly skilled workers for their own purposes in terms of, running their facilities in an ASEAN country. So those are my two initial comments. I see that we have, shall we start with, this is, please forgive me, I don't know all of you and I can't see all of you, so sorry, Tutpaporn, please first. Please introduce yourself and give your name and affiliation and then proceed with a comment or question, please.
Yeah, My name is Sari Tapapon. I live in San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm associate with the U.S. Lao PDR Exchange Institute. So I heard a lot of information about other country, but as far as the labor is concerned, or people, hello?
Hello?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I don't hear a lot about the people from Laos, from Cambodia, from Myanmar. As far as I'm concerned, the level of education in those countries is kind of lower than in Thailand, in Malaysia, in Philippines, in Singapore. So how we gonna narrow in terms of the standard, educational standard between these two group of people, the group of nation? I'm talking about the original ASEAN versus the new member of ASEAN, namely Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam.
Great.
Vietnam up there.
Great. Well, wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us all the way from the West Coast today, and we really appreciate you joining and for your remarks and questions. Whit, would you like to take that issue up?
Yes. So part of this is that these countries are at different levels in their development, which makes kind of having a one-size-fit-all system not going to work.
Yeah.
So from what I could find on Laos and Cambodia, the economy is still largely agrarian. There's a lot of agriculture involved, and the infrastructure makes it more difficult for, say, you to have a centralized school of any sizable size. What I would say is that investment there should focus on kind of moving towards more manufacturing or focusing more on the agriculture in the region. Right now in Laos, for example, a lot of domestic businesses seem to be focusing more on low-skilled labor. They don't necessarily need high-skilled or certified labor for what they are trying to do. For educational wise, I would say that is something that does seriously need to be invested in. One of the most effective ways would be, say, an internet program so that you don't have to go far away from your home, and that will allow more students to actually attend school. The challenge in Laos and Cambodia right now is, according to the information I found, the internet penetration rate is about 20%. I don't know exactly where that is in Laos, but I'd imagine it's largely in cities, which would have less of a challenge in that way. But as for economic development, as, say, Thailand moves more towards 4.0 manufacturing, medical devices, for instance, there's going to be a demand for automotive manufacturing, which I would imagine would then move to Laos or Cambodia. And then more funds come in, that allows greater access to education.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And now we turn to Ambassador Piper Campbell for the next question, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Satu, it's great to see you, and thank you for this presentation, and thank you for everything that the East-West Center is doing to keep the conversation going and the learning and the work going during these times. I love this topic. As Satu knows, I was the head of the US mission to ASEAN, and so engaged a lot in that context with all of the countries of ASEAN, including in our programs around the shared economic objectives. I agree that the Young Southeast Asian Leadership Initiative, YSEALI, is a good example of a program that a strong program of the United States in engaging with youth in the ASEAN. Another example that I think is somewhat interesting is the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, so the U.S. ABC internship program, which was launched about 2 years ago, and which is working primarily with American companies resident in Southeast Asia, in the ASEAN countries, to create internships in Southeast Asia for Southeast Asian citizens. And I wondered whether you would consider that as similar to the vocational training in terms of creating opportunities for meeting the types of skills which are needed. I also was wondering, you mentioned the Lower Mekong Initiative. The Lower Mekong Initiative has a partnership with Arizona State University for young scientists. And I guess I'm just trying to figure out, when you think about vocational training and you separate between vocational training and what you described as higher education, could you speak a bit to what you see, where and what those distinctions are, and whether you see there being areas for Japan-US cooperation with higher education as well as vocational training.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. That was great. Whit, over to you.
Yes, so I don't know too much about the U.S. ASEAN Business Council internship program. That does sound very interesting. I'd have to look at, say, what are the requirements to apply, for example, to actually make a good statement on that. As for the difference between vocational education and higher education, usually I'm thinking of a 4-year degree as higher education from a college or a university. And there are challenges there too. So the Thai Board of Investment has said that there is challenges even there. It's 20% of graduates can expect a job in 1 to 3 months. The rest might have to wait over a year to get a job. Part of that is because a lot of them go into social sciences, which I personally love, but doesn't directly translate into a job. I would imagine, therefore, there is opportunity for, say, higher education cooperation as well and collaboration. But what that would entail is a little bit outside the scope of my research.
Okay, well, thank you, Whit. Let me turn now to one of my colleagues at the East West Center, Ms. Charity Borg, who is a young Air Force officer with us on the Young Professional Program. And we have to read the questions so that the YouTube viewers who are also watching simultaneously are able to understand the question, because they're not able necessarily to read this online, as I understand it. I myself am learning. I hope some of you are too, because I feel like I'm learning as we go on how these virtual programs link and work. So Ms. Borg's question is, so while most projects worldwide are delayed, is it correct to understand that, Whit, you are seeing automation projects being fast-tracked in the region? And the second question, so that one is really in this context, do you see more movement towards automation, or less, or the same, or however your understanding is? And the additional question Ms. Borg asks is, considering US funding constraints, which I had touched upon in my initial remarks, what 1 or 2 efforts would you find to be most important vocational efforts for automation training?
So I'll take that second question first. That's a bit quicker to answer. I would imagine vocational education needs to focus on things like coding, because that is going to be what replaces call center jobs, for instance. Or, and then for jobs in, say, car manufacturing or in textiles, that's going to be a lot of electronics, a lot of robotics. So focusing on skills such as being able to repair robots is going to be where the new jobs, kind of those skills are demanded. So, and then I am currently, before COVID-19, there was a big push for automation. I can't speak as to what is happening right now for a lot of those programs, but I would suspect from my discussions that Southeast Asia will at least try to accelerate automation because they want that resiliency. Whether they're able to do that is the big question.
Okay, let me go back here and see if there are any other questions. I don't see any other. Am I missing someone, Sarah? Or looking here on the answer, or are there any from YouTube? One new message. Yes, there is apparently one.
While we're waiting in that, I would like to update something. I cited the Thailand Board of Investment. I'm afraid that's wrong. It was the Confederation of Thai Trade and Industry that was talking about the college and hiring rates.
Great. Thank you very much for that clarification. And in the meantime, we do have another hand raised. This is from Sam Driggers. Mr. Driggers, would you please introduce yourself and have a question or a comment, please? Mr. Driggers? Mr. Driggers, at least I can't seem to hear you well. Could you please try again?
Can you hear me now?
A little bit better, but not very well, I'm afraid.
Okay, I apologize. My question happens to be, what opportunities are available for U.S. community colleges that are engaged with to engage with ASEAN counterparts?
Okay, that's very good. The question from Mr. Driggers was what opportunities might be available for U.S. community colleges to integrate with, to cooperate and interact with ASEAN on the vocational training front.
So some ASEAN countries are actually trying to create community colleges as something of a compromise between vocational education and colleges, universities. So I would say there's an opportunity there. Unfortunately, I didn't do an extensive amount of research into community colleges in Southeast Asia, so I don't know the details there.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for that. That may be something you can take up as you go further. And we now turn to Dr. Ellen Frost, our Senior Advisor at the East-West Center. Dr. Frost? I've been told to read Dr. Frost's question again, as I did for Ms. Borg. To your knowledge, Whit, are the U.S. and Japan coordinating their approaches to Southeast Asia to any significant extent, both generally and regarding vocational training?
So regarding vocational training, right now I haven't seen anything about them coordinating. On a larger perspective, most people I've talked to have said their focus is on the process of developing the Blue Dot network. And I imagine we'd see more coordination as that goes forward.
Great. I think there are no more questions in line, and I see no in the unanswered Q&A or the chat room for the present. So I think we can adjourn, but let me just say thanks again to all of you for being part of the experiment with this first virtual program of the U.S.-Japan Southeast Asia Visiting Fellows Program. I think Whit has gotten us off to a remarkably fine start, and I thank you, Whit, for your patience, for all of our participants. Thank you for bearing with us. We're learning this as we go, and and really appreciate it. And I would just flag for you that we have 5 more fellows in the program. And these 5 fellows will be also presenting over the next few weeks. They're based in London, in Japan, in Southeast Asia, and of course the United States. So I hope you'll stay tuned, be part of our newsletter, be part of our East-West Center community as we build the next generation of American, Japanese, and Southeast Asian experts and future practitioners on key issues that engage our trilateral relationship. So thank you very much, everyone. Please stay safe, stay well, and we look forward to you joining us again. And thank you to Sarah Wong for organizing this webinar. Thank you very much indeed. Good day.